at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The noise is a cacophony of constant chaos, suitcase wheels crunching on cracked concrete pavement, laughter, and lingering goodbyes from strangers. A bustling world, full of meetings and partings. But my world at that moment had shrunk cruelly. It was just the face of the cop standing in front of me, red with anger or drunkenness, his rough, calloused hand pressed against my sternum, hard enough to make it hard to breathe. And his voice, oh, that voice. It rang in my ears, acid and prejudiced, like a bad recording I had heard too many times in my life. "I'm asking you this one last time," he gritted, the inevitable little spray of spittle hitting my face. I could smell the cold, stale coffee and cheap Virginia tobacco wafting from his mouth. "Where did you get the money to buy this, huh? Tell me. You don't look like the type of person who can afford this." His name was Miller. I read the name on the scratched, slightly warped metal plaque that was attached carelessly to the left breast of his uniform, which looked as if it hadn't been ironed in a week. He looked to be in his 50s, maybe close to 60, with a bulging beer belly that pushed his frayed leather belt down below his navel, and small, shifty eyes that narrowed with an inherent suspicion of the world, especially of people who didn't look like him. Next to Miller, a younger and obviously less confident clone, was Officer Davis. He looked to be in his mid-20s, his face still baby-faced with a few red pimples on his chin. Davis stood a little behind Miller, like a shadow seeking protection. His face was tense, his eyes darting from one passerby to the other, then down to the toes of his shoes, his right hand fiddling with the PR-24 baton that hung at his side. Obviously an apprentice, a pushover, a weakling trying to appear tough by going along with the bullying of his superiors. My black Toomey leather briefcase, a trusty companion that held my encrypted laptop with its national security reports, counter-terrorism plans, sensitive intelligence analysis, and a few personal items, now lay abandoned on the dirty concrete sidewalk next to a puddle of stagnant brown water. It had been tossed there by Miller's hand, uncaring, as if it were a bag of trash. A cold shock ran down my spine for a moment, a disbelief that this couldn't really be happening. But it was quickly replaced by a dull, painfully familiar anger. An anger I had learned to control, to push down deep in my chest, to turn it into a layer of ice that covered the surface. I took a deep breath, trying to slow my rapid breathing, concentrating on keeping my face expressionless, a blank mask honed over nearly 3 decades of dealing with all kinds of crime, all kinds of danger, and all kinds of prejudice. Observe, analyze, evaluate. That's what I've been trained to do, and that's what I'm doing right now. "Here we go again," a tired, almost exhausted voice echoed in the back of my mind. It wasn't fear, but a deep sense of frustration. 55 years old, nearly 30 years of blood and soul devoted to this country, to upholding law and justice, climbing to a position that thousands aspire to, a position that requires endless sacrifice and responsibility. And yet, here, in the eyes of these people, I am still just a black guy in an expensive suit, an anomaly, a potential threat. Just because of the color of my skin, and because I dare to dress inconsistently to their prejudices. My name is Marcus Jones. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, in a working-class family that taught me the importance of education, hard work, and self-respect. I worked hard, graduated with honors from Harvard Law School, and joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation with a dream to make a difference, protect the vulnerable, and catch real criminals. I rose through the ranks, from a rookie agent running small cases, to leading organized crime task forces, to leading major field offices, and finally, to being appointed by the president to my current position, director of the FBI, the person with the ultimate responsibility for an organization with tens of thousands of employees operating globally, facing the most complex and dangerous threats to the national security of the United States. And yet, here I was, being treated like a street criminal by 2 lowly airport policemen. Just a few hours ago, I was sitting in a high-security room, known as a SIF, at FBI headquarters in the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. Surrounded by generals from the Pentagon, senior officials from the Department of Homeland Security, and top intelligence analysts, we were discussing a massive cyber threat to our nation's financial infrastructure, how to stop a terrorist group planning an attack overseas, and how to work with allied intelligence agencies to dismantle a transnational human trafficking ring. The decisions made in that room could affect the lives of thousands of people, the stability of an entire region. The pressure was intense, the responsibility was enormous. After the meeting, I decided to catch the earliest commercial flight back to Atlanta. I have an informal meeting tomorrow with community leaders here, but the main reason is that I want to go home. I have a house in Buckhead, not a mansion, but a real home. I miss Sarah, my wife, who has been with me through thick and thin, who has always been my rock. I miss the laughter of our 2 teenage children. I just want to have a normal evening, eat Sarah's home-cooked meal, listen to the kids talk about school, and temporarily leave the burdens of the world outside the door. I usually fly commercial when my schedule allows, even if I can request a private jet. It's a way to keep my feet on the ground, to avoid being isolated in the Washington bubble of power, to remember who and what I serve. The suit I was wearing, a classic charcoal gray Anderson & Shepherd, had been tailored for me when I was in London for an Interpol conference. It was not ostentatious, but part of the job, a symbol of the professionalism, the seriousness, the authority that came with my position. But in the prejudiced eyes of Miller and Davis, the suit had become incriminating evidence. It was too expensive, too fancy, too out of place on a black man like me. Their twisted logic could only lead to one conclusion. I must be a criminal, a drug dealer who had just pulled off a big heist, a professional con man, a money launderer, or something equally dirty and illegal. I am a law-abiding citizen, I repeated, trying to keep my voice even and calm, though inside, anger was starting to boil like a smoldering volcano. I could feel my jaw clenching involuntarily. I just flew back from a business trip from Washington, D.C. I can show you my plane ticket and identification. Miller let out a snort, a dry, unpleasant sound, like sandpaper on wood. Work? What the hell kind of work requires such a shiny suit? Probably work to smuggle a few pounds of white powder through security? He winked at Davis meaningfully. Davis, clearly encouraged by his senior's rudeness, chimed in, though his tone was still a little awkward. Or does he advise the gangs down the street on how to do business? Split the profits, perhaps? The blatant insult, the unbelievable ignorance in their words, made my stomach twist. I felt the blood rush to my face, my ears ringing with anger. But I bit my lip, swallowing the bitter taste of humiliation. I knew the game. They were deliberately provoking me. They wanted me to lose my temper, to react with aggressive words or actions. If I just pushed Miller's hand away or cursed loudly, they would have an excuse to throw me to the ground, handcuff me, and then write in my report that I had resisted a law enforcement officer. It would be the perfect confirmation of the sick prejudices boiling inside their heads. I would not give them that excuse. I have identification, I said again, my voice a little firmer, and began to slowly reach for my inside coat pocket. Freeze! Miller shouted, his voice full of authority, his hand pressing harder into my chest, nearly knocking me off balance. Put your hands where I can see them. Now! I paused, raising my hands slowly to shoulder level, palms facing out, a fake but necessary gesture of surrender to avoid escalating the situation. Inside my coat pocket, I said clearly. My wallet. Miller gave me a suspicious look, then jerked his chin. Take it out. Slowly. I carefully reached into my pocket and pulled out my dark brown alligator wallet, the kind I carried every day. I opened it, revealing my Georgia driver's license and a few credit cards. I deliberately left my official wallet untouched. I wanted to see how far they would go. I wanted to give them enough rope to hang themselves. Miller snatched my wallet from my hand. He pulled out his driver's license, squinting to read the information in the weak light of the afternoon. "Marcus Jones," he said, drawing out the last syllable with a mocking drawl. "Born July 15th, 1968. Address, 1200 West Paces Ferry Road, Atlanta, Georgia." He paused, looking up at me with even greater disbelief. "Buckhead? You live in West Paces Ferry? That millionaire's mansion? How the hell does a guy like you live there? Did you win the lottery?" The invasion of privacy, the brazen indictment of my home address, left me feeling exposed in the middle of this crowded airport. He glanced at the occupation on my license. I hadn't updated it in years. It still read Government Advisor, a title vague enough not to draw unnecessary attention in this mundane situation. "Oh, Government Advisor?" Miller sneered again. "That sounds cool. Advise what? Advise who? Advise corrupt congressmen on how to launder dirty money, I guess." He tucked the license into his own breast pocket, along with my wallet. "Give me back my license and wallet, Officer Miller," I demanded, my voice starting to cool, my patience running thin. "You have no right to keep them." "That's not all, Jones," Miller replied, a smug look on his face. "My colleagues and I have reason to believe you are transporting contraband or illegal items. We need to search your luggage." "You don't have a warrant," I protested, citing the law I knew like the back of my hand. "You don't have any probable cause to suspect me. Your stop was illegal, based on racial profiling. Your search request is an even more serious violation of my Fourth Amendment rights." Miller waved my words away like they were flies. "What law? I am the law here," he growled, his face now taking on an undisguised ferocity. "You have two choices. Either you volunteer to let us quickly inspect that briefcase, or you come with us to the station, sit in a piss-smelling holding cell all night answering 100 stupid questions, and then we get a warrant to search your things. Choose." He turned to Davis, who stood there, pale a little at the direct confrontation with the law, but still not daring to protest. "Davis, search his briefcase, now!" Davis flinched, seeming to hesitate for a split second. Perhaps the young man's remaining conscience was struggling, but then a razor-sharp glare from Miller was enough to silence any thoughts of resistance. He obeyed immediately. He bent down, picked up my Toomey briefcase clumsily, and placed it on the hood of his battered, scuffed, and dusty white and blue Ford Crown Victoria. The metal zipper squeaked as he opened the briefcase. I stood there, helpless, watching as he pulled the contents of my briefcase out, splaying them out on the roof of the patrol car as a few passers-by paused for a moment before hurrying on. The government's most encrypted Dell laptop. The thick binder stamped Top Secret/SCI on the cover. Inside were analyses of cyber threats and foreign intelligence operations that I planned to review on the plane. A few paperbacks on history and foreign policy. Anchor power bank. The Mont Blanc Meisterstuck fountain pen Sarah had given me for our anniversary. A small travel-sized toiletry bag. A few energy bars. My heart pounded harder as I watched Davis's hands flip through the classified documents. He clearly didn't understand the abbreviations, the complicated diagrams, the names and places mentioned inside. To him, they were just meaningless pieces of paper. But if even a fraction of this information were to leak out, the consequences would be dire. I held my breath, hoping he would quickly let it go. "Nothing suspicious, Miller," Davis said after a moment of rummaging, his voice tinged with disappointment. "Just business papers, computers, books. No drugs, no large sums of cash, no weapons." Miller frowned, disbelieving. He stepped forward, pushed Davis aside, and began rummaging through the contents himself. His large, rough hands rummaged through everything roughly, with no respect for my personal property or the sensitive nature of my work. He picked up the laptop, shaking it as if checking for anything hidden inside. He picked up the confidential file, flipped through a few pages indifferently, then threw it back into the open briefcase with a dry thud. His face darkened with disappointment. His plan to find evidence of a crime and capture this well-dressed black man had failed. For a moment, I hoped that this nightmare was about to end. They had found nothing. They had no reason to keep me any longer. Maybe they would return my things, mumble some perfunctory apology for the mistake, or simply get in their car and drive away in a huff. But I had underestimated the corruption and greed of people like Miller. The failure to find evidence of a crime did not seem to deter him, but rather it triggered an even worse plan B in his small, prejudiced brain. He would not leave empty-handed. He turned to look at me, and this time, instead of anger or suspicion, a sinister, calculating smile slowly spread across his red face, a smile that disgusted me even more than the previous insults. "Listen, Jones," he said, his voice suddenly lowering with a sickeningly fake familiarity. "It seems like you're having a bad day, huh? Getting stopped and searched by the police in the middle of an airport? What a pain." He clicked his tongue, feigning sympathy. I stood still, straightened, and stared at him, waiting. I knew exactly what was coming. The smell of corruption, of abuse of power for personal gain, was stronger and more unpleasant than the smell of gasoline fumes and garbage around here. It was a cancer that was eating away at the very foundation of society. "Me and Davis," Miller continued, glancing at his young colleague for confirmation, and Davis, though initially confused, nodded quickly. "We can let this one go. Just a little misunderstanding, right? You don't look like a criminal, just a little suspicious." He chuckled. "But you know, the paperwork to resolve misunderstandings like this is a mess. You have to write this report, submit it to your superiors, and then file it. It takes a lot of time and effort on our part." Davis, fully invested in this terrible drama, quickly picked up the pace. "Yes, sir. Mr. Jones, if we follow the proper procedure, we'll have to take you to the airport police station, then take a report, then do a detailed interrogation, maybe keep you overnight to verify more information, release you tomorrow morning, then have you appear in court in a few weeks. Big trouble, affecting your important advisory job." He deliberately emphasized the word advisory. Miller's greedy gaze swept over my suit again, not with suspicion this time, but with an assessment of value. A man as successful and well-dressed as you would be would not want his name associated with some police station mess, would he? It would be a hassle in the papers. He paused, letting the threat sink into the thick air between us. Then, he gave a figure, his voice as light as if he were haggling over an item at a flea market. "Just a little goodwill, Jones. A little contribution to smooth the process, you know what I mean? Consider it a fee to get this all settled quickly and smoothly right here. About $5,000 in cash would be nice." $5,000. $5,000 in cash. He had just casually priced my temporary freedom, of complete innocence, my dignity, and the inconvenience he had caused for himself in that figure. A wave of disgust and anger surged through my chest, hot and bitter as fish bile. This was more than stupid racism. This was outright extortion. This was the systematic, deliberate abuse of power by men given a badge and a gun to protect people, not to rob them. They were the very embodiment of corruption, of betrayal of the oath they had sworn. In that instant, a cold, scalpel-sharp decision formed in my mind. All patience, all intention of a peaceful resolution evaporated. I would not let this end here. I would not give them a dime. I would not simply walk away after they realized their mistake, if they were capable of realizing it. These men, Miller and Davis, they had to be punished. They had to be stripped of the uniform they were defacing. They had to face the legal consequences of their crimes. They were a sore that had to be excised from the body of law enforcement, where thousands of other good officers worked day and night with integrity and courage. But I had to act smart. I was still physically vulnerable, alone against two armed policemen who were clearly not above breaking the law. I needed irrefutable evidence. I needed to ensure my own safety before I turned the tables. I rolled my eyes again discreetly, confirming the location of the security camera mounted on a lamppost about 20 meters away. The tiny red light was still flashing steadily. Good. It might not record audio, but the images of their actions, especially the upcoming gesture of demanding money, would be crucial evidence. I tried to commit to memory the exact words of Miller and Davis, the tone of their voices, the time of the incident, around 4:30 p.m., the specific location, near Pillar 5, the domestic terminal bus pickup area. I considered for a moment whether to discreetly dial the emergency number of my security team, who were waiting for me in the official parking lot, or to call the Atlanta FBI office, which was only a 15-minute drive from the airport. But no, the time was not right. I wanted them to dig themselves deeper into the hole they had dug themselves into. I wanted the shock of the revelation to be strong enough, unexpected enough to knock them off their feet, to leave them no room for fabrication or denial. I wanted them, by their words and actions, to provide further evidence against themselves. $5,000? I repeated, my voice now completely calm, even somewhat mock-curious. The sudden change in my demeanor seemed to take Miller by surprise. That's the price you set for letting go of a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that, if I'm not mistaken, you created yourself? Miller shrugged shamelessly, the smirk still on his lips. He clearly thought I was starting to cave, that I was scared and willing to pay to get out of trouble. Call it whatever you want, Jones. Expedited processing fee, silence fee, time-saving fee. You're smart. I know you'll understand. He held out his right hand, palm up, fingers curled, a crude and unmistakable gesture of demand. Cash only. No checks, no credit cards, $5,000. Give it to us, and we'll forget we ever saw you. Get in some fancy car waiting for you and go home in your nice clothes. Simple as pie. Davis moved a little closer to my other side, as if to form an invisible pincer, increasing the psychological pressure. The atmosphere between us became thick, tense to the point of suffocation. A few passers-by glanced at us curiously, but no one stopped. They walked faster, eyes straight ahead, trying to appear as if they had seen nothing, heard nothing. That indifference, although I could understand the fear of getting into trouble with the police, still made my heart ache with an indescribable sadness. I stared at Miller's outstretched hand, calloused and grimy, the hand that should have been used to uphold justice, but now demanded a bribe. Then I slowly raised my head and looked straight into his small, cunning eyes. My gaze no longer concealed anything. It was cold and piercing and held a weight he could not comprehend. It's time. This show must end. Officer Miller, Officer Davis, I said, my voice now devoid of hesitation or patience. It rang out clearly, sharply, each word emphasized, carrying a cold authority that I rarely had to use in everyday life, but always had. I think that right now, you have made a very, very serious mistake. A mistake that, I assure you, will change both of your lives. Forever. The absolute confidence, almost arrogance in my voice, clearly caught them off guard. It didn't sound like a frightened victim or a negotiator. Miller's frown deepened, the smirk fading from his lips, replaced by a look of annoyance and wariness. Davis began to look genuinely worried again, his eyes darting to Miller for direction. "What the hell are you talking about?" Miller snapped, trying to regain the upper hand. "Don't you stand there trying to be smart and scare me. Who do you think you are?" I didn't bother to answer his stupid question. Instead, I did something more eloquent than any words. I slowly, very slowly, almost deliberately, reached with my right hand into the left inner pocket of my suit jacket, not the one I had taken my wallet from earlier. Another pocket. "Freeze!" Miller yelled again, this time with a hint of panic in his voice. His hand instinctively went to the butt of the Glock at his hip. Davis did the same, his face pale. "Get your hands where I can see them! Now! What are you doing?" They thought I was going to draw my weapon. Their stupidity and blind prejudice had clouded their ability to reason logically. They could not imagine that the real threat to them was not a gun, but something else entirely. I pulled out a black leather wallet, different from the brown one that held my driver's license. This one was simpler, but it carried an invisible weight. It was where I kept my identity as a public servant. I opened the wallet with a resolute expression. Inside, under a slightly worn transparent plastic, was an unmistakable yellow card. In the center of the card was the majestic eagle seal of the United States Department of Justice. Below it, the shiny badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Above my stern portrait were the bold, blocky letters, clear as day. Federal Bureau of Investigation, United States Department of Justice. And below the photo, my name and title were printed clearly, without any ambiguity. Marcus Jones, Director. I held the wallet open, raising it a little to Miller's eye level so that the faint light of the afternoon illuminated the powerful yellow card and that fateful inscription. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, silent, my gaze cold and sharp as a freshly sharpened dagger, staring deeply into the eyes of the two policemen, which were beginning to dilate with an emotion they had never experienced before. I let the cruel, unbelievable truth slowly seep into their slow, prejudiced brains. Silence fell over us. A heavy, thick silence, broken only by the distant hum of the airport and my own heart pounding in my chest. It lasted about 3 seconds, or maybe 4, long enough for Miller and Davis's world to collapse. Then I saw it, the sequential transformation on their faces, happening like a dramatic slow-motion film. At first, there was utter confusion. They squinted, trying to read the words on the card over and over again, as if they couldn't believe their eyes. Miller's lips moved along with each letter, but no sound came out. Perhaps they thought it was a joke, an elaborate fake. Then came the dawning recognition. Their eyes widened suddenly, their pupils dilated. A flash of terror began to flash in their eyes as their brains tried to connect the name Marcus Jones and the title Director to the news they might have heard. FBI Director? Impossible. Finally, there was sheer terror, a primal, instinctive fear that gripped them, draining the blood from their faces. Miller opened his mouth, but for a moment, no sound came out. The hand on his holster shook involuntarily. He looked as if he had seen a ghost in broad daylight. Davis reacted even worse. He took a step back, then another, his legs barely able to support him. He staggered, almost falling. His face was as white as a sheet, his lips trembling. "Oh, God! Oh, God! No! No!" All he could do was moan like a lunatic, his hands clutching his head. I remained silent, still holding the card in place. My eyes never left Miller, the mastermind. I wanted him to see the absolute contempt in my eyes. I wanted him to understand that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. I didn't need to say anything more. That card, that title, said it all. The cheap ballpoint pen and small notebook that Miller was holding in his other hand fell to the ground, creating a small clack that echoed loudly in this extremely tense silence. Davis raised his hand to cover his mouth, trying to stop the sob that threatened to burst out. Then, as if a switch had been turned on, as a natural reflex of someone who knew he was doomed, they began to beg. The change in their tone and attitude was so rapid that it would have been almost ridiculous if the situation had not been so serious. From being arrogant, patronizing, and rude, they changed to being subservient, fearful, and pathetically begging. "Director Jones! Sir! Please!" Miller was the first to recover, his voice shaking and shaking with fear. He almost fell to his knees on the spot. "Please! There's been a misunderstanding. A terrible misunderstanding. Oh my God, we didn't know. We really didn't know it was you. We were just doing a routine patrol, sir, Davis sobbed, tears actually starting to stream down his young face. Routine patrol. It's just that you were dressed a little differently, and He couldn't finish, realizing the stupidity and self-incrimination of his own excuse. Please forgive our ignorance. Miller clasped his hands before his chest, a pathetic pleading gesture I usually only saw in people about to be thrown into prison. We didn't mean to offend you. We acted like fools. Please, please be merciful. Don't ruin our careers. We have families, wives, and children at home. The urgency, the desperation in their voices did not move me in the slightest. On the contrary, it only made me more disgusted. This was not genuine remorse for their wrongdoing. This was not remorse for being racist, for trying to extort money from an innocent citizen. This was pure, utter fear for themselves, for their jobs, for their pensions, for their selfish futures. They were not afraid of doing the wrong thing. They were afraid of doing the wrong thing to the wrong person, someone with the power to crush them. Finally, after letting them expose their own cowardice for a few seconds, I spoke up. My cold, emotionless voice rang out clearly and sharply in the air, cutting off their pathetic pleas. Misunderstanding? I asked, raising an eyebrow sarcastically. You call demanding $5,000 in cash from a citizen you stopped without cause a misunderstanding, Officer Miller? I deliberately emphasized the word officer, which now sounded like a sarcastic mockery of the title he was defiling. I turned to Davis, who was trembling and avoiding my gaze. Do you call treating a man like a criminal based solely on the color of his skin and the clothes he is wearing doing his duty, Officer Davis? I looked back at both of them, my voice becoming even more stern. You call this blatant violation of the rights of citizens protected by the Constitution, the abuse of the position and power entrusted to you by the people to commit despicable acts of extortion, unintentional. Each of my questions was like an invisible hammer blow, making them shrink back, their faces paler. Silence fell again, this time broken only by Miller's ragged, rapid breathing and Davis's incessant sobbing. They had nothing more to say. No more excuses. I didn't waste any more time. I pulled my secure cell phone out of my pocket. My fingers quickly flew across the touchscreen, opening the encrypted address book and finding the contact I needed. You have the right to remain silent, I said, my voice even but deadly forceful, as if I were reading a criminal indictment. Anything you say from now on can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. I read them their Miranda rights in full, a bitter irony I was sure they could not miss in their panic. After reading my Miranda rights, I dialed. The call connected almost immediately. This is Director Jones, I said into the phone, my voice immediately professional, cool, and efficient. I am in the domestic terminal pickup area, Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, near Pillar 5. I am requesting the Chief of Airport Police and Special Agent in charge of the FBI Atlanta Field Office to my location immediately. Situation code Alpha Gamma 09. 2 airport police officers are to be detained for investigation of serious charges of abuse of power, violation of federal civil rights, and attempted extortion. I glanced at Miller and Davis's name tags again to make sure. The 2 officers involved are Officer Michael Miller, badge number 714, and Officer Robert Davis, badge number 921. I read their names and badge numbers clearly and distinctly into the phone. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, then a quick, urgent, alarmed tone. Roger that, Director. Understood. Unit is en route. We'll be at your location in less than 5 minutes. I hung up and put the phone back in my pocket. Then I stood there, arms crossed, silently observing the 2 police officers who now looked more pathetic and pitiful than any criminal I had ever encountered in my career. They stood there, frozen in the middle of the crowd, trembling like leaves under my cold gaze, their futures, their families, everything they had ever had, now falling to pieces right before their eyes because of blind greed and stupid, ingrained racism. They had ruined their own lives. Less than 5 minutes later, just as promised over the phone, the area around us suddenly erupted into chaos, with sirens and flashing red and blue lights. 3 airport police patrol cars came barreling toward us from different directions, slamming on their brakes right next to us. Doors swung open, and other police officers jumped out, their hands on their weapons, their faces tense, ready to deal with the emergency they had just been told about. Following closely behind were 2 jet black SUVs, unmarked Ford Expeditions that everyone in the industry knew were FBI vehicles. They stopped precisely behind the patrol car. The door of the lead SUV opened, and a man in a neat gray suit, with a stern Asian face, stepped out quickly. It was David Lee, the special agent in charge of the FBI Atlanta field office, a man I knew well and respected for his competence and integrity. He was followed by 4 other FBI agents, all wearing tactical vests over their shirts, with FBI emblazoned on the back in bright yellow letters. They moved quickly, professionally, fanning out, securing the scene, assessing the situation. At the same time, a man in a high-ranking police uniform stepped out of one of the patrol cars. His shoulders were decorated with 3 silver stars, and his uniform was neatly pressed, a stark contrast to the slovenliness of Miller and Davis. It was undoubtedly the chief of airport police. He rushed toward us, his face showing confusion and extreme anxiety. When they saw me standing there, strangely calm in the middle of the siege, my suit still pressed despite the minor struggle, my cold gaze unchanged, then looked at Miller and Davis, who were cowering, their faces drained of blood, sweat pouring down their faces, the chief of police's face showing utter horror and shame. He had clearly been briefed on the situation over the radio. Agent Lee walked straight toward me, bypassing the others. "Director Jones," David Lee greeted formally, but his voice held no trace of genuine concern. "Are you all right? Did something serious happen?" "I'm fine, David," I replied, my voice still in control. "Thank you for coming so quickly." I inclined my head toward the 2 standing still. "But these 2 officers are not fine." I looked straight into the eyes of SAC Lee and the chief of police standing next to me, my voice clear, without hesitation. "These 2 airport police officers, Officer Miller and Officer Davis, just stopped me without cause as I was leaving the terminal. They illegally searched my luggage, and after finding nothing, they attempted to extort $5,000 in cash from me to drop the matter. The only reason for their actions, as far as I can determine, was because they did not like the color of my skin and the clothes I was wearing." A deadly silence fell over the area as I spoke the brutal truth. Several airport police officers standing nearby who had heard the story gasped in shock, then looked at Miller and Davis with disbelief and contempt. The chief of police looked as if he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him up right then and there. His face was red with anger and shame. He turned to Miller and Davis, his voice hissing through gritted teeth. "You guys! What the hell have you done? Do you know what you've done?" But Miller and Davis were powerless to respond. They just looked down at the ground, shaking, Davis's tears now streaming down his cheeks. They knew it was over. I turned back to SAC Lee, shifting to a businesslike tone. "David, I want your office to formally take over this case. Work closely with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division to conduct a comprehensive criminal investigation and pursue prosecution. Potential charges include, but are not limited to, violations of civil rights under color of law, pursuant to Section 242, 18 U.S.C., attempted extortion under the Hobbs Act, conspiracy to commit a crime, and other state and federal charges that may be pursued as the investigation progresses." "Yes, Director," David Lee replied immediately, his voice firm and professional. We will treat this case with the highest priority and ensure that all procedures are followed." He turned and gestured to two FBI agents standing nearby. Two tall, stony-faced FBI agents stepped forward, pulling out shiny steel handcuffs. Under the shocked gazes of a few curious passengers who had lingered to see what was happening, and to the utter embarrassment of their fellow airport police, Miller and Davis were pushed into the patrol car. The FBI agents read them their Miranda rights again, clearly, and then quickly and skillfully handcuffed their hands behind their backs. The cold, metallic click of the handcuffs marked the abrupt and ignominious end to the careers of the two abusers. They offered no resistance, simply standing there like lifeless corpses, resigned to their fate. "Take them away," the airport police chief ordered his subordinates, his voice still shaking with shock and anger, but also determined. "Take their weapons, badges, radios, and all official paraphernalia away immediately. Take them to the station's holding room, seal their lockers and all files related to them. And I want all of you to cooperate fully, providing all information necessary for the FBI investigation. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," the police officers replied in unison. Miller and Davis, who had been swaggering about their power just a few minutes ago, were now being led away by their own colleagues like criminals. As they passed me, Miller suddenly raised his head, his narrow eyes meeting mine. In those eyes, I saw no remorse or regret, only deep hatred, resentment, and the utter despair of a man cornered. I looked back at him, unwavering, my gaze cold and unwavering. Justice had only just begun to be served. There was still a long way to go in the courtroom. The weeks and months that followed were a whirlwind of federal justice. As I had predicted, the machinery worked with efficiency and ferocity. The Atlanta Airport Police Department's internal investigation was swift and inescapable. Miller and Davis were found to have violated a wide range of departmental codes of ethics, procedures, and policies. They were fired immediately, losing their accumulated pensions and all other benefits. They were placed on a national blacklist, ensuring that they would never again work in law enforcement anywhere in the United States. In parallel, the FBI-led criminal investigation, closely supervised by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division in Washington, had amassed a massive and incontrovertible body of evidence. My detailed and consistent testimony, as a victim and a highly credible witness, was of course central to the case. But it did not stand alone. It was reinforced by video footage from an airport security camera that I had been keenly aware of. Although it had no audio, the video clearly captured the entire episode: the unjustified detention by Miller and Davis, the illegal search of my briefcase on the hood of the patrol car, and, most importantly, Miller's brazen gesture of holding out his hand for money while Davis stood by, supporting me. Video analysts confirmed that their actions were consistent with my account of the attempted extortion. In addition, investigators recovered radio recordings from Miller and Davis before and during the incident. These recordings revealed racist and prejudiced exchanges between the two as they watched me emerge from the station, discussing checking out this black guy in a fancy suit. They provided strong evidence that their actions were not random or a misunderstanding, but rather intentional and motivated by clear racial discrimination. Miller's work history was also reviewed, and several similar complaints of bullying and discrimination were discovered in the past, although there was not enough evidence to warrant serious disciplinary action. With all the evidence in hand, a federal grand jury quickly voted to indict Miller and Davis on a series of serious federal charges. 1. Violation of civil rights under color of law. This crime targets the abuse of public power to intentionally deprive an individual of rights protected by the United States Constitution or law, in this case, the right to equal treatment, the right to be free from unreasonable searches under the Fourth Amendment. 2. Attempt to interfere with commerce by threats or violence. This charge applies to attempted extortion, since their actions were directed at a person, me, traveling between states and had the potential to affect interstate commerce. 3. Conspiracy to violate civil rights. This crime applies when two or more people conspire together to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate any citizen in the exercise of rights or privileges guaranteed by the Constitution or laws of the United States. The criminal trial took place a few months later in the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers eager to follow the shocking case. I was required to appear and testify in court. It was never a pleasant experience, even for someone as accustomed to legal proceedings as I was. Standing on the witness stand, under the scrutiny of hundreds of pairs of eyes, recounting in detail every moment of humiliation, every insult, every feeling of helplessness and anger that I had experienced at the airport that day, was extremely difficult. It was like digging up a wound, but I knew it was necessary. I had to do it not only for myself, but for the countless other victims of racism and abuse of power who have no voice or standing to seek justice. I presented my testimony clearly, coherently, objectively, focusing on the facts and avoiding excessive emotion, even though I was still angry inside. Under the questioning of the sharp female federal prosecutor and the questioning of the two court-appointed defense attorneys for Miller and Davis, my testimony stood firm and was in perfect harmony with the other physical evidence. The defense attorneys tried their best to minimize their client's guilt. They tried to paint a picture of an unfortunate misunderstanding, of stressful work by the airport police, of lapses in judgment, not malice. They even insinuated in a despicable way that I, as FBI director, had overreacted to a routine situation or had abused my position of power to retaliate against two low-ranking officers. But those defense arguments were completely ridiculous and could not stand up to the weight of the irrefutable evidence. The security video, the radio recordings, my testimony, and the inconsistencies in Miller and Davis's own cross-examination. The jury, made up of 12 carefully selected citizens from different walks of life, did not waste much time deliberating. After only about 4 hours of deliberation, they returned to the courtroom with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts against both defendants. A murmur rose in the courtroom as the verdict was read. Miller and Davis stood there, pale, their limbs trembling. Their last shreds of hope had been dashed. Sentencing was scheduled a few weeks later. The courtroom was packed again. Federal Judge Eleanor Vance, an elderly African-American woman with a high bun of white hair and a stern but even-tempered gaze, who had presided over the proceedings with professionalism, sat solemnly at the top of the dais. She asked Miller and Davis to stand. The two ex-cops, now dressed in rumpled orange prison jumpsuits, looked a decade older than when I had first met them at the airport. Before handing down her sentence, Judge Vance delivered a brief but powerful speech. She spoke of the sacredness of the oath every law enforcement officer takes to serve and protect. She spoke of the trust the public places in those who wear the badge, expecting them to uphold justice and protect the rights of all citizens, regardless of color, status, or circumstance. Then she spoke of the abhorrent and intolerable betrayal when those entrusted with that power abuse it to satisfy personal greed and narrow-minded racial prejudice. The defendant's conduct, Judge Vance said, her voice echoing throughout the courtroom, not only severely damaged the dignity and rights of an individual who, ironically, was the head of the nation's most prestigious federal law enforcement agency, but it inflicted a much deeper wound. It eroded the already fragile trust of the public, especially minorities, in the entire criminal justice system. It dishonored the honor of tens of thousands of other upright police officers who risk their lives day and night to serve their communities with dedication and courage. She looked straight at Miller and Davis, her eyes unforgiving. Racism and greed have no place in law enforcement. Abuse of power must be punished with the harshest possible punishment to serve as an example to others. Then she pronounced her sentence. Based on the federal sentencing guidelines, the seriousness of the charges, and the defendant's lack of genuine remorse, Judge Vance sentenced Michael Miller and Robert Davis to 15 years in federal prison each without the possibility of parole. 15 years. A long and harsh sentence, but one that was entirely proportionate to the crimes they had committed. It sent a clear and powerful message that the legal system would not tolerate such corrupt and racist behavior, no matter who committed it. The sobs of Miller and Davis's relatives in the back row filled the courtroom as the two men were handcuffed and escorted out of the courtroom by U.S. Marshals Service officers to begin their sentences. I sat quietly in the front row, showing no outward emotion. Justice had been served, but the victory was bittersweet. Several months have passed since the verdict. I am sitting in my office on the 7th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building. Outside the large bulletproof glass windows, the pale yellow of an autumn afternoon is bathing the National Mall in Washington, D.C., from the proud Washington Monument to the white dome of the Capitol in the distance. Everything looks peaceful, so majestic. The Atlanta airport incident has faded from the media spotlight, replaced by other breaking news stories. But its aftermath, the complex emotions it stirred, remain deeply embedded in my mind. Justice was clearly and strongly served in my particular case. Two people who had taken advantage of the color of the law to commit crimes paid a heavy price. In theory, it was a victory for what was right, an affirmation that no one is above the law. But I felt no real joy of victory, no gloating or satisfaction. There was only a lingering sense of fatigue, an indescribable heaviness in my chest, and a deep sadness about the state of the society in which we live. I won. Yes. But I can't help but wonder, would I have won if I weren't Marcus Jones, director of the FBI? If that powerful yellow card hadn't been in my wallet that day? What if I were just another successful black lawyer, doctor, businessman, college professor, or any other black man who dared to commit the crime of wearing an expensive suit in public? What if I didn't have SAC David Lee's direct phone number or the ability to request the chief of airport police? Would I have the courage and composure to confront them? Or would I have to bite the bullet and pay that $5,000, money I probably didn't have, to avoid trouble, to get some peace, to get home to my family? Or worse, would I be accused of resisting arrest if I resisted, got handcuffed, taken to jail, falsely accused, and my life, career, and reputation that I had spent my entire life building destroyed in an instant? The answer, sadly, is that I probably wouldn't have gotten justice that easily. The FBI director's badge was my shield, my ultimate weapon that turned the tables. It was what made their fears come true. And that makes me wonder, how many other Marcus Joneses out there, people with no titles, no power, no connections, have faced similar suspicion, prejudice, harassment, and abuse of power every day? In unwarranted traffic stops, in street stops for looking suspicious, in everyday interactions with people who harbor prejudices based on their race, gender, religion, or anything else that makes them different? How many of them suffer in silence, swallowing their tears because they know that their voices are weak, that they have no security cameras to back them up, that no one will believe them when they confront those in power? I vividly recall the look of panic on Miller and Davis's faces when they saw my card. In their eyes, I saw no remorse for their racist behavior or attempted extortion. I saw only utter fear for themselves, the horror of realizing they had offended the wrong person, of facing the inevitable dire consequences for their careers and personal freedom. Racism and greed were so deeply ingrained in their subconscious that only fear of personal punishment could overcome them, not conscience or respect for the law. In subsequent meetings with senior Justice Department leaders, and in my talks with new agents at the FBI Academy at Quantico, I did not hesitate to share my story. I wanted them to understand that no one, not even the FBI director, is immune to racism. I wanted to emphasize the importance of diversity hiring, ongoing bias awareness training, de-escalation skills, and especially accountability. We must build a culture where every officer, every agent, understands that abuse of power and discrimination will never be tolerated and will face the most severe consequences. We must ensure that people like Miller and Davis have no place in the ranks of law enforcement. That evening, when I returned to my quiet suburban Virginia home after a long day at work, Sarah was waiting for me at the door with a big hug. She had read the news, had heard my part of the story. In her eyes, I saw concern, anger on my behalf, but most of all, pride in the calm and resolute way I had faced and handled the situation. Her warm embrace, the laughter of my two children arguing over a basketball game echoing from the living room, these were the precious things I have, am, and will always fight to protect. Not just for my small family, but for all families, all citizens of this country who deserve to live in a more just and safe society. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow we will have another meaningful story for you.